It all started years ago in Newark, a city that was known for its bustling streets, bright lights, and constant hum of activity. A city where people walked with purpose, cars honked in a steady rhythm, and the subway echoed with the sound of tired commuters heading home. On the surface, Newark seemed like any other city. It had its problems, yes, but it was a place that felt alive. But beneath that surface, deep in the shadows of the night, there was a story. One that no one talked about, and one that no one dared to remember. It was a story about a killer who was never seen, but always present, stalking the streets with a terrifying silence. They called him the Silent Stalker. The disappearances began slowly at first. Just one person here, another there. People went missing in the dead of night, vanishing without a trace. At first, it didn't seem too unusual. After all, Newark wasn't a place where bad things didn't happen. People disappeared all the time, often tied to bad decisions, gang activity, or the harsh realities of city life. But these disappearances were different. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no mess. It was like the victims simply disappeared. 1 minute they were there, and the next they were gone, like a ghost without a single shred of evidence left behind. What was even stranger was the lack of noise. No screams for help, no desperate shouts, no sound of struggle. Just silence. It was as if the victims had been taken away without a sound, without anyone even noticing. The neighbors never heard a thing. The night was always eerily calm. It wasn't until Sarah, a young barista who lived in the heart of the city, disappeared that the rumors began to spread. She had been working late, closing up shop around midnight, like she did most nights. She lived in a small apartment not far from the coffee shop. It was a quiet part of Newark, tucked away from the chaos of the main streets. Sarah's disappearance was different from the others. People knew her. She was friendly, always had a smile for everyone, and never seemed to have a problem. Her disappearance wasn't just another tragedy. It felt personal. The morning after Sarah's disappearance, her apartment was found just like it always was, clean, tidy, and undisturbed. Her front door was unlocked, her shoes neatly placed by the door, and her jacket draped over the back of a chair, just as she had left it the night before. But Sarah was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken locks or windows, and no sign that anyone had ever entered. Just silence. The police searched the entire area, but they found nothing. No leads, no witnesses, and no clues. The city's residents began to talk. At first, it was just whispers. People would meet in dimly lit corners of bars, or on the quiet subway platforms, exchanging nervous glances as they spoke in hushed tones. They spoke of the disappearances, of the unsettling calm that followed each one. They spoke of a man. No one ever knew his name, but everyone referred to him as the Silent Stalker. They said he was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. The only thing he left behind was silence, and that silence was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. They'd say, "When you hear the silence, it's too late." and they meant it. Those who had gone missing never made a sound. The stalker didn't need to make noise. His presence was enough. And those who felt his presence never came back. For months, the disappearances continued, but the police were no closer to solving the mystery. It was as if the silent stalker was always one step ahead. No one saw him. No one heard him. He was just a presence, a shadow that crept through the city, unseen and unheard. But he was there. The strange thing was, no one could figure out how he did it. There were no reports of anyone being attacked. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just people disappearing into thin air. 1 minute, they were walking down the street. The next minute, they were gone. It was as if they'd never existed. Rumors grew darker. People started to wonder if it wasn't a man at all. Some said the silent stalker was something worse, something unnatural. A ghost, maybe, or a demon. People began to avoid the streets at night, especially in the quieter areas of Newark. The thought of being taken without a sound, without anyone even knowing what happened to you, terrified them. And it wasn't just the victims who were vanishing that people feared. It was the idea that anyone could be next. That silence could fall at any moment. No warning. No escape. But the real horror was not the disappearing people. It was the growing feeling that the silent stalker wasn't just some killer. He was something that haunted the city. Something that couldn't be caught or stopped. He was part of Newark now. He had become a shadow that hung over every street, every alley, every home. And as the months went by, more and more people began to believe that the silent stalker was no longer just a man. He was a curse. A curse that would never end. Each disappearance seemed to add weight to the city's fear. No one could explain it. No one knew how he did it, or why. But they all knew one thing for sure. The silent stalker was real. And when the silence fell, you'd be the next to vanish. At first, people tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was just another tragedy, another bad thing that happened in a city that had seen its fair share of darkness. But the silence wouldn't let them forget. It followed them everywhere, in the dark corners of the city, in the quietest nights, in the places where no one dared to go. The silent stalker was there, waiting, watching, and when the silence fell again, no one was prepared for what was to come next. This extended version adds more depth and detail, making the story even more gripping and terrifying, all while keeping the pacing slow and methodical. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or make any adjustments. The first victim was a young woman named Sarah. She was a local barista, well known to the regulars who came into the small, cozy cafe on Elm Street. Sarah had a way of making everyone feel special. She was kind-hearted, always taking the time to ask how someone's day was. offering a warm smile even on the toughest of days. Her laughter, though soft, was infectious, and her presence in the cafe made it feel more like home than just another coffee shop. She worked late shifts, usually closing up the shop just after midnight. It wasn't uncommon for her to take a slow walk back home afterward, breathing in the cool Newark air. She had always been a night owl, enjoying the quiet stillness of the city when most people were tucked in their beds. That night, like many before it, Sarah clocked out, grabbed her jacket from the back room, and made her way out the door. The streets were quiet, a rare calm before the chaos that the city was known for. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalks as she walked, the only sound being the soft tapping of her shoes on the pavement. She didn't think twice about the chill in the air, or the faint rustling of leaves that moved with the wind. But that night was different. Sarah didn't know it yet, but something was following her. Something dark. Something she could never have imagined. It wasn't the kind of thing you would see or hear. No, this presence was silent, like the calm before a storm. It moved with her, keeping its distance, but never far enough for her to feel safe. It was the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The kind of silence that was heavier than any sound. When Sarah arrived home, she did what she always did. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and set her things down. There was nothing unusual about her apartment. Everything was just as it always was. The dim light of the hallway flickered as it illuminated the small, neat space she called home. The walls were lined with photographs of friends, family, and her travels. A single lamp on the coffee table cast a warm glow across the room. It was a peaceful place, a place where Sarah could unwind after a long day. But something wasn't right. Her neighbors, who were usually very attuned to the sounds of the building, heard nothing that night. The normal sounds of laughter and music from adjacent apartments never came. There were no sounds of footsteps in the hall, or the usual chatter you'd expect from a bustling apartment complex. In fact, it was almost as though the entire building had fallen into an eerie, suffocating silence. It wasn't until the next morning that anyone realized something was terribly wrong. Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Williams, a retired school teacher who lived next door, was the first to notice. She had grown used to hearing Sarah's soft footsteps as she came home late at night, followed by the faint sound of a door closing. But that morning, Mrs. Williams didn't hear any of that. The hallway was deathly quiet. Curious, she knocked on Sarah's door, calling out her name. When no response came, she knocked again, louder this time. Still, there was nothing. She frowned and tried the door, expecting it to be locked. But to her surprise, it swung open easily, as if it had been left ajar. Mrs. Williams stepped inside, calling Sarah's name again. It was then that she noticed something that chilled her to the bone. The apartment was exactly as it always was. The fresh scent of Sarah's coffee lingered in the air, and the soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room. But there was something off. On the kitchen counter sat a half-empty cup of coffee, still warm to the touch. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign that Sarah had ever been in danger. The apartment was neat, just like Sarah had always kept it. Yet, she was gone. There were no signs that she had left. Her coat, which she always hung by the door, was still there, draped neatly over the chair. Her shoes were placed by the entrance, where she'd always left them. But Sarah, she was nowhere to be found. The police arrived soon after Mrs. Williams called them. They combed through the apartment, looking for anything that might indicate where Sarah had gone or what had happened to her. But there was nothing. The door was unlocked, but there were no signs of forced entry. Her phone, wallet, and purse were all accounted for. Her bed had not been slept in, and her personal items were untouched. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The investigators talked to her friends, checked the cafe where she worked, and asked everyone who might have seen her in the hours before she disappeared. But no one knew anything. Sarah had just disappeared. No one could understand how. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. Weeks went by, and the case went cold. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no idea where Sarah had gone. No one had heard from her, and her absence left a gaping hole in the community. Her regular customers at the cafe asked about her, but no one had any answers. The police weren't much help either. They had no clues, no suspects, and no explanation for what had happened. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Sarah faded into the background. Life in Newark continued, as life always does, but the silence left behind by Sarah's disappearance weighed heavily on the city. But what was even stranger was that as the weeks passed, no one else seemed to be worried. The city continued its busy, chaotic existence, but the fear of what had happened to Sarah and what might happen to others lingered in the background. No one really talked about it much. It was almost as though people had become numb to the silence that had followed her disappearance. And then, something strange started happening. Other people began to disappear. One by one, individuals started to vanish from Newark, just like Sarah. Some were from quiet parts of the city, others from busy, bustling areas. It didn't matter. They all disappeared in the same way. No signs of a struggle, no screams, just silence. The police couldn't explain it. The city couldn't explain it. But the Silent Stalker, whatever he was out there, and he wasn't done. Months went by, and with each new disappearance, the silence grew louder. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next victim to be claimed. The police were no closer to finding Sarah, and no closer to stopping the disappearances. The fear that had once been a whisper in the corners of Newark now loomed over the entire city like a shadow. The silence, it seemed, would never end. This extended version of Chapter 2 dives deeper into the mystery surrounding Sarah's disappearance and sets the tone for the unfolding horror. Let me know if you need more details or want me to expand further. The next few years were filled with quiet terror. At first, people tried to ignore the disappearances, convincing themselves that it was just a series of isolated incidents, nothing more than bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. But as time passed, the number of missing persons began to rise, and the pattern that emerged was nothing short of horrifying. Each new case was eerily similar to the one before, as though the same unseen force was at work, claiming victims one after another, with no explanation, no motive, and no clue as to why. Each time someone disappeared, it was the same story. The victim would vanish in the dead of night, leaving behind no signs of a struggle, no bloodshed, no broken windows, and no forced entry. Their homes were found just as they had left them, as if the person had simply walked out and never returned. The doors were unlocked, the windows were untouched, and in many cases, the victim's shoes were neatly placed by the door, just as if they had been about to step out. It was as if they had stepped into thin air, leaving the world behind with nothing but an unsettling silence. There was no evidence of any sort of attack, no broken locks, no damaged furniture, not even a sign that the victim had been afraid. It was as if they had simply walked into the dark and never looked back. The silence after each disappearance was deafening. Neighbors would knock on doors, ask around, but there was never any answer. And when the police arrived, all they could do was search, question, and speculate, but they never found anything. There were no leads, no fingerprints, no traces of anything out of the ordinary. It was as though the victims had disappeared into thin air, without a trace, without a sound. No one knew where they went, and no one knew why. At first, the authorities were reluctant to believe that something more sinister was at play. They chalked up the disappearances to runaways, mental health issues, or just bad luck. But as more and more people disappeared, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. Something was happening in Newark. Something that no one could explain. The city's residents, already on edge, began to grow anxious. They whispered in hushed tones, avoiding certain streets at night, locking their doors more carefully, and looking over their shoulders more frequently. But still, the silence followed. The police had no suspects, no answers. They were as helpless as the rest of the city, struggling to make sense of something that didn't make sense. As the years went by, the disappearances continued, one after the other, with no sign of stopping. Each victim seemed to vanish in the exact same way. And soon, it became clear that this wasn't just some random string of bad luck. This was something deliberate, something terrifying. But the strangest part, it wasn't just the disappearance itself that was so unsettling. It was the aftermath. The victims' homes were always found in perfect order, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. It didn't make sense. How could someone just vanish, leaving no evidence behind? How could someone be taken without a sound, without a struggle? The questions piled up, but the answers were always just out of reach. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. People started to talk. They said the Silent Stalker wasn't just a man, but something worse, something unnatural, something that defied explanation. Some believed he was a ghost, a shadow that moved unseen among the living. Others whispered that he was a demon, a creature born from the darkest corners of the earth, sent to take souls for reasons no one could comprehend. There were even those who believed he was a curse, an ancient force that had found its way into Newark, claiming its victims one by one, with no hope of escape. The fear spread like a virus, infecting everyone who lived in the city. People began to stay home more often, locking their doors at night, refusing to venture out after dark. Even those who didn't believe in the rumors couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence in the city became louder. The once bustling streets of Newark felt more like a graveyard, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next victim to be claimed. And every time someone disappeared, the silence grew. It was as if the city was being swallowed whole by the darkness, and there was no way out. Families lived in constant fear, afraid that their loved ones would be next. Children stopped playing outside after dark, and parents clutched their children tighter as they walked down the street. It wasn't just the fear of being taken that terrified people. It was the uncertainty. They didn't know who was next. They didn't know if they were safe. They didn't know if the Silent Stalker would come for them in the night. And worse, they didn't know if they would ever be found, or if they too would vanish without a trace. The police, meanwhile, were no closer to finding an explanation. They scoured the city, investigating every lead, but there was never anything to find. No clues, no evidence. The case grew colder and colder until the media stopped reporting on it. But even as the public attention waned, the fear didn't go away. People were still disappearing, the rumors still spread, and the silence still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. And then something strange happened. A new victim, someone who had been taken in the same way as the others, was found. But this time, there was something different. This time, there was a clue. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was enough to stir the waters of the investigation. On the wall of the victim's apartment, in faint, almost imperceptible writing, were the words, "I am always watching." The words sent chills down the spines of those who saw them. It was as if the Silent Stalker had left a message, a sign that he wasn't just a shadow in the dark. He was real, and he was closer than anyone had ever realized. The police began to take the case more seriously, but the fear in the city had already reached a fever pitch. People were starting to wonder if it was too late. Was the Silent Stalker something that could be stopped? Was he even human? And if not, what kind of monster was terrorizing the streets of Newark? What had started as whispers in the dark had now become a full-fledged nightmare, one that no one could escape from. As the disappearances continued, the city began to change. Newark, once a lively place, became a town of quiet dread. And the more they tried to understand the Silent Stalker, the more they realized that they were facing something beyond their comprehension. Whatever it wasn't just a man. It wasn't just a killer. It was something darker. Something that thrived on fear. And as each day passed, the fear grew, and the Silent Stalker grew stronger. And no one could stop him. Not the police. Not the city. This expanded version of Chapter 3 dives deeper into the city's response to the mounting disappearances and the growing fear surrounding the Silent Stalker, setting the stage for a much darker and more terrifying discovery. Let me know if you'd like further details or want to continue the story. The disappearance of Alex was the turning point, the moment when everything changed. Until then, people had whispered about the Silent Stalker, exchanging stories in hushed voices, in dark corners of bars, at the backs of buses, and over the sound of low, anxious conversations. It was easy to dismiss the rumors as just that, rumors, stories spun by those who were afraid of the dark, or perhaps the result of a few too many drinks. Alex had been one of those people. He was young, in his early 20s, a bright college student with his whole life ahead of him. He was also a skeptic, the kind of person who laughed off urban legends and dismissed them as silly myths. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, and he certainly didn't believe in the stories about the Silent Stalker. For months, he'd listened to his friends talk about the disappearances, the eerie stories of people vanishing into thin air without a trace. He had rolled his eyes, making jokes about how people were probably just running away from their problems or getting caught up in something criminal. To him, it was all just coincidence or exaggeration. There was no way someone or something was silently picking off people one by one. The idea that a supernatural force could be behind these disappearances was laughable. But then, on the night he disappeared, Alex's perspective would change forever. It was late, past midnight, when Alex found himself walking home from a late-night study session at the library. The streets were quieter than usual, and the city's usual hum was replaced by a hollow silence that seemed to stretch across the night. Newark was never quiet, and that stillness felt unsettling. The wind was calm, and even the usual sounds of cars and distant chatter had faded into the background. Alex felt it then, the uneasy sensation of being watched. It wasn't a typical feeling of paranoia. No, it was different. It was the feeling that someone or something was out there, keeping a close eye on him, waiting. Shook the thought away, telling himself it was just his imagination. He had walked these streets countless times before, and there had never been anything to fear. Still, the sense of unease wouldn't go away. As he walked down the familiar alley near his apartment, he glanced over his shoulder. That's when he saw him. Standing at the far end of the alley, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. The man, or whatever he was unmoving, like a silhouette carved into the darkness. Alex stopped dead in his tracks. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as though the figure had been there, waiting for him, and now he was caught in its gaze. The man didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply stood there, shrouded in the deep shadow of the alley, watching Alex. The hairs on the back of Alex's neck stood on end, and his stomach churned with an unfamiliar dread. The city was known for its occasional rough spots, but he'd never seen anything like this. Who was this person, standing so still in the dead of night? Why didn't he make a sound? Why didn't he move? Alex tried to convince himself that it was just some stranger. Perhaps another late-night wanderer. Maybe someone just passing through. But the more he stared, the more he realized there was something wrong about this man. The way he stood motionless, like a statue. The way he was so eerily quiet. No shifting of weight, no sound of breathing. It felt unnatural. Alex took a cautious step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, just as he moved, something shifted in the air. The silence grew thicker, almost suffocating. It wasn't the silence of a quiet street or the calm of an empty night. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, one that pressed against his ears, making it hard to think, to breathe. It was in that moment that Alex heard it, the sound of nothing. That was the moment he understood. This wasn't just some random stranger. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the Silent Stalker. A wave of terror washed over him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could hear was the ringing in his ears, the beating of his heart, and that damn silence, closing in on him, suffocating him. He couldn't even run. It was as though the very air around him had frozen, locking him in place. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching him, waiting. In a burst of panic, Alex did the only thing he could think to do. He ran. He turned and bolted, not looking back. But even as he ran, he felt the weight of the silence trailing behind him. He could feel the figure's presence, as if it were an invisible force that moved with him, shadowing his every step. The silence was deafening. drowning out everything around him, making him feel more alone, more isolated than ever before. It was as though the world had stopped spinning, and there was only him, running through an empty world, pursued by an unseen terror. Alex reached his apartment, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He locked the door behind him, his hands trembling. He tried to shake the image of the man in the alley from his mind, but he couldn't. That silence, that weight, was still with him, still pressing on his chest. He knew, deep down, that something had changed. Something had happened that night that he couldn't explain. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. The way the figure had watched him without moving, without making a sound. The silence. He had always thought that the stories were nothing more than that. Stories. But now he wasn't so sure. The next morning, Alex sat down at his desk, still shaken by the events of the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something had followed him home. His hands were still trembling, and his mind was racing. He needed to make sense of it, to understand what had happened. That's when he reached for his journal. He wrote quickly, his thoughts spilling out onto the page. I saw him. I don't know who or what he is, but I saw him watching me, standing by the alley, in the shadows. I thought I was being paranoid, but no one is supposed to move that quietly. And when I heard the silence, that's when I knew. It's too late. Alex didn't know what he was writing or why, but it felt like he needed to get it out, to put the terror he was feeling into words. Maybe it was a way to make sense of the nightmare he had experienced, or maybe it was a way to document the encounter before it slipped away into the haze of fear and confusion. That was the last anyone ever heard from Alex. His body was never found. No one knew what happened to him or where he went, but the journal entry remained, left behind, like a breadcrumb trail, a message that told the world that the Silent Stalker was real. And that was when people realized the truth. The Silent Stalker wasn't just a killer. He wasn't just a man lurking in the shadows. He was something else entirely. He was a ghost, a shadow, something that moved through the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Something that left nothing behind but silence and fear. And no one was safe. Not anymore. Alex's disappearance marked the moment when the terror truly began. The Silent Stalker had been unleashed, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the disappearances continued, the city of Newark was suffocating under a blanket of fear and uncertainty. More and more people vanished every month, and no one knew where they went. A group of locals, people who had been watching the horrors unfold from the shadows of their homes and workplaces, had finally reached their breaking point. They couldn't sit idly by any longer, watching their friends and family vanish without a trace. They had to know what was happening, what was causing these disappearances. But most importantly, they had to know who or what was responsible. So they decided to investigate. It was a dangerous decision, but at that point, anything felt better than just waiting to be the next victim. The group was a mix of individuals, each with their own personal reasons for wanting to find answers. Some had lost loved ones to the Silent Stalker, while others simply couldn't shake the haunting feeling that their city was slipping into a nightmare they couldn't escape. They began meeting in secret, away from prying eyes, and started discussing the possible causes of the disappearances. They researched, they asked questions, and they pieced together bits of information that didn't seem to fit. As the pieces started to fall into place, the truth, when it finally emerged, was far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. It wasn't until they began digging through old records, talking to past residents, and scouring through forgotten archives in the city's historical society that they began to uncover something truly disturbing. The names of people who had lived in Newark decades ago, people who had been forgotten by time, began to surface. These were the people who had lived in the shadows long before the Silent Stalker began his reign of terror. And among these names was one that stood out, a man who went by many different names, but most commonly, he was known as Eli Carter. Eli Carter was a loner, a man who had always kept to himself. He lived in the outskirts of Newark, in a small, crumbling house on the edge of the city, where no one dared to venture. He was a strange man, one who rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were cryptic, full of obscure references and odd notions. He was known for his eccentricities, and for the way he would wander the streets at night, muttering to himself. It was said that he had once been a scholar, a man of knowledge and intellect, but over the years, he had become something else entirely. People whispered that he had turned to darker pursuits, delving into forbidden knowledge, seeking out ancient rituals and occult practices that were better left forgotten. No one knew, for sure, what drove Eli Carter to these dark practices, but rumors swirled about him. It was said that he was trying to reach the other side, to cross into a realm beyond the living. There were stories of him performing rituals late into the night, chanting words no one could understand, burning strange symbols into the earth, and offering sacrifices. People would often see him walking through the woods late at night, carrying strange objects, his eyes hollow and wild. They said he was searching for something powerful, something that could give him more than just knowledge. It could give him control, power, and immortality. Then, one night, something went terribly wrong. Eli Carter had been preparing for what he called the final ritual, the one that would open the gateway between worlds. No one knew exactly what he hoped to achieve, but the whispers suggested that he was trying to cross into the realm of the dead, to bind his soul to the other side, or perhaps to call forth a force far darker than any of them could imagine. That night, the ritual was set to take place under the cover of darkness, deep in the woods, just outside of Newark. But when the morning came, Eli Carter was gone, vanished. No one knew what happened to him, and his house, which had once been filled with strange symbols and unexplainable objects, was left empty and abandoned. The police investigated, but they found nothing. It was as if Eli Carter had simply evaporated, leaving no trace behind. His books, his notes, and all his occult artifacts were gone, swept away, as though they had never existed. It was as if he had vanished into the air, leaving only an eerie silence in his wake. And that was when the strange occurrences began. At first, it was subtle, small things, almost easy to overlook. But soon, the city began to feel different. The air grew thick with unease, and the streets became quieter, darker. People began to whisper about strange sights and sounds in the dead of night. The first disappearance occurred soon after Eli Carter's vanishing, and it set off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. Over time, the disappearances became more frequent, and the city grew more tense, more fearful. And through it all, one thing remained the same. No one ever heard anything. No screams. As the group of locals pieced together what they had uncovered, they came to a horrifying conclusion. Eli Carter had never really left. He hadn't been swallowed up by the ritual he had tried to perform. He had become something else, something more powerful, something that could never be truly destroyed. He had learned how to transcend death, to become a part of the very fabric of Newark itself. He had learned how to haunt the streets, to fade into the background. His presence only felt through the silence that followed him wherever he went. The Silent Stalker was not just a killer. He was the product of a failed ritual, an ancient force that had been set free and now walked among the living, taking what he wanted whenever he wanted. Every victim, every soul he took, added to his power. The more people he claimed, the stronger he became, and the cycle would continue, endlessly, forever, unless someone could stop him. A group of locals, now desperate and terrified, realized that they were up against something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. They weren't just fighting a maniacal killer. They were facing something that defied explanation. The Silent Stalker was not just a man. He was something born from the darkness, a creature of shadow and silence, something that had been unleashed on the world. And now, there was no way to stop him. The truth had been revealed, but it was too late. The Silent Stalker had always been there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that the truth was out, there was no escape from the nightmare that had gripped Newark. The silence would continue. The terror would never end. The terror that once haunted Newark had grown into something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The Silent Stalker was no longer just a shadow in the dark corners of the city. He had become a part of it, an unrelenting presence that the people could no longer escape from. They had tried to resist, tried to fight back, but the fear had taken root too deeply in their hearts. Every whispered rumor, every hushed conversation only fueled the terror that had overtaken them. And the worst part was, no one knew when or where he would strike next. People in Newark no longer slept easy at night. It didn't matter where you lived or how careful you were. The fear was universal. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone had heard the whispers. The tales of those who had vanished without a trace, leaving only the silence behind them. It wasn't just a ghost story anymore. It was real, and it was all around them. The Silent Stalker didn't just hunt the lost or the forgotten. He hunted anyone. Anyone could be next. He wasn't just a man or a creature. He was something far worse. Some said he was a ghost, the restless spirit of someone who had crossed into the afterlife but never found peace. Others believed he was a demon, a dark, malevolent force that preyed on the living, feeding off their fear and their souls. The truth was that no one knew what the Silent Stalker really was. They only knew what he did. He stalked the streets, waiting, lurking in the shadows. His presence was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was always there. People would often describe a strange feeling, a prickling on the back of their neck, the sensation of being watched when no one was there. It was in the way the city seemed to hold its breath in the middle of the night, when the usual sounds of traffic and life quieted to an unnatural stillness. The moment the wind died down and the night grew quiet, they knew the Silent Stalker was near. It wasn't just the silence that terrified them. It was what the silence meant. It meant that someone, somewhere, was about to be taken. And once you had heard it, once you had felt that cold, suffocating silence, you knew that your time was running out. It didn't matter who you were or where you were. Once the Silent Stalker had marked you, you were already part of his story. And that story never had a happy ending. As the years passed, the killings continued. The people of Newark tried to go on with their lives, tried to pretend that everything was normal, but they couldn't escape the constant dread that hung over them. The city had changed. It wasn't just the streets that felt different. It was the people. They were different now. They had learned to live with the fear, to walk the streets with their heads down, eyes darting nervously from side to side. They avoided dark alleys. They stayed inside after sunset, and they locked their doors tightly at night, knowing that it wouldn't make a difference. The Silent Stalker wasn't bound by locks or walls. He didn't need to break in. He didn't need to force his way into your life. All he needed was the silence. That was his invitation. And once you heard it, some people tried to fight back, of course. They told themselves that they could outsmart the stalker, that they could find a way to stop him. But the more they tried, the more they realized how hopeless it was. The Silent Stalker was always watching, always waiting. There was no way to fight him, no way to escape him. He was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow that would always find you. And it wasn't just the deaths that haunted the city. It was the absence, the emptiness left behind after each victim was taken. The families left behind, the questions with no answers, the never-ending cycle of fear and uncertainty. As time went on, the people of Newark became more desperate. Some turned to superstitions, lighting candles, performing rituals, trying to ward off whatever force had taken over their city. Others locked themselves away, refusing to leave their homes at night, terrified that the Silent Stalker would find them in their sleep. But no matter what they did, the killings never stopped. The Silent Stalker always found a way, always found someone new to take. The terror never ended. It was endless, like a dark cloud hanging over them, pressing down on them until they could no longer breathe. The city was broken. The people were broken. And no one knew how to stop it. The authorities, the police, they were just as powerless as everyone else. They couldn't explain the disappearances. They couldn't explain the silence. They couldn't even find a way to track the killer, let alone stop him. And the more they tried to investigate, the more the fear grew. They had no answers, and every day more people vanished. The only thing that remained was the silence, and that silence was louder than any scream. Years passed, and Newark became a ghost town, a place where no one dared to venture after dark. The streets that had once been lively, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, were now eerily quiet. The cafes were empty. The bars were deserted. And even the subways had fewer passengers. People had left the city, fleeing in fear of the Silent Stalker, seeking refuge in other towns, other states, anywhere they could go to escape the terror that had taken hold of Newark. But even as they left, they knew that the Silent Stalker was still out there, still hunting, still waiting. The people who remained were living ghosts, their lives overshadowed by the fear that one day they too would vanish into that silence. The truth was that no one knew if the Silent Stalker would ever stop. Maybe he would take them all, one by one, until there was no one left. Or maybe he would just continue to haunt the city, a shadow that would never fade, a nightmare that would never end. What they did know was that once you heard the silence, you were never truly free. You were always part of his story now, and there was no escaping it. In the end, Newark was lost. The city that had once thrived was now just a shell of what it used to be. A place where fear had taken over, where the silent stalker roamed the streets, waiting for the next victim. The people who had once called it home would never forget the terror they had lived through. But for the most part, they had moved on, trying to rebuild their lives elsewhere. But Newark itself would never be the same. It had become a place cursed by the Silent Stalker, and the fear he instilled would never truly leave. The killings never ended. The terror never stopped. Because once you had heard the silence, you became a part of his story. And that story would never end.